Hey, it's Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be reading a selected reading from Blood at the Root. It's by Patrick Phillips, and we'll be reading Chapter 4, And the Mob Came On. Bill Reed was in a foul mood when he got to work on Tuesday morning, upstaged by Marvin Bell and humiliated by the fact the confessed rapist had been delivered not to Cummings but to the Gainesville City Police. Reed was under pressure to make more arrests, particularly after rumors circulated that Ernest Knox was not alone when he attacked May Crow. Over the night, the initial reports of Crow's injuries had been elaborated into a kind of horror story. Those men had raped May many times, Ruth Jordan said years later. They bit on her legs and cut her and chewed off the nipples off her breasts, I guess. In an hour, all the people in the county had armed themselves and was just waiting. Reed and Loomis rode out to Oscarville first thing Tuesday and found a group of white men had already surrounded Marcus Walthrop's property and taken prisoner one of Walthrop's field hands, the young black man known as Big Rob Edwards, who had been seen with Knox the day of the attack. Knox may have been the confessed rapist whose name was in all the Atlanta papers, but he was also far out of reach in the Fulton Tower and under the protection of the Atlanta City Police. Unable to lay a finger on him, whites in Oscarville now directed their wrath at Rob Edwards, who, like Tony Hole, was a conspicuous as outsider in an island, isolated community of Oscarville, having been raised in South Carolina. When Reed and Loomis arrived on the scene, the Georgians said they went immediately to look and took the Negro from his captors, who were planning to lynch and burn him right there on Walthrop's place. After placing Edwards under arrest on suspicion of rape, Reed and his deputy hurried back toward town, trailing behind them a growing crowd of white men with shotguns and pistols in their hands. Having watched Grant Smith, Tony Howell, and Ernest Knox escape the noose in the past few days, many in the crowd had lost all patience, and that the law and now saw it as a duty to defend the white women of their county from future attacks. A reporter described the atmosphere as they followed Edwards all the way into Cummins. The country roads were dotted and mounted with armed men, all hurrying towards the county seat, as though some wireless telegraphy has spread the news of Edwards' capture. The men of Forsyth had been gathering all day, bearing rifles, shotguns under their arms, others with coats bulging where a heavy revolver filled the hip pocket. They were silent for the most part, but they gathered in little knots at the corners of the street and waited. The journal agreed that mob spirit was at fever heat when Reed and Loomis finally brought Edwards to the Cummings Square and forced their way through the throng and managed to lock him inside an iron-barred cell. When they peered out through a window, a mob of more than 2,000 men swarmed the little brick jail. When the lawyers and merchants and gentlemen farmers of Cummings looked up from their desks and shop counters to see what was causing all the commotion, they had found this same chaotic scene with which the race troubles had begun the previous Saturday. Now, as then, hundreds of whites were screaming themselves hoarse in the public square, demanding that officials hand over an accused black man. Like Smith, Howell, and Knox before him, Rob Edwards would have been able to pick out individual voices in the crowd, men whose names and faces he knew well from having worked shoulder to shoulder with them in the orchards and cotton fields and the corn rows of the county. When these men threatened to slit his throat, castrate him, and roast him like a hog, Edwards knew they meant every word. A big, lumbering man of 24, Edwards could only watch silently as Loomis came and went with his ringing of his jangling keys. It is at this point that Bill Reed committed the most incriminating act of his entire tenure as Forsyth County Sheriff, which was to simply disappear. A reporter noted his absence as if it were a minor detail, writing the sheriff left the jail as soon as he had lodged a prisoner there, and Deputy M.G. Loomis was left in charge. But given the ongoing political rivalry between the Forsyth County Sheriff and his deputy, Reed defeated Loomis in the 1912 election, and would face him again in 1914. It is almost certain that Reed's disappearing act was the result of a careful calculation. The governor has ordered the loyal lawmen to stop the spread of mob violence in Forsyth, but as a future Klansman himself, whose name appears on a list of local KKK members in 1920. Reid was no doubt sympathetic with the crowd chanting for Edwards to be handed over, and as eager as they were to see a black man punished for the attack on May Crow. To help them get what they wanted, all Reid had to do was nothing, and so the mob swelled as the threat of lynching grew more and more serious. Reid called Loomis over and took him to take command of the little jail. And he rose from his desk, adjusted his hat, and walked out to the packed square, with no explanation but for the occasional nod to friends and relatives as he passed. By leaving Loomis and charge the moment of great crises, Reid nearly sidestepped what was for him a political train wreck, and his thrust his rival directly in his path. The young deputy failed to hold off the lynchers. It was now his head that would roll when the governor called from Atlanta. And if Loomis somehow succeeded in repelling the lynch party, he would remember come election time as a nigger lover who'd stopped the white men of Forsyth from avenging a dying girl. As he impelled down Castleberry Road, Reid couldn't have failed to understand the dire situation in which he left Gay Loomis and Rob Edwards. In 1912, Georgia mobs regularly stormed county jails and abducted black prisoners, and it had happened many times before in coming. 50 years earlier, in 1862, the Daily Constitutionals had reported that a Negro boy belonging to Judge E. Lewis of Forsyth County was taken out of the Cumming jail and hung last Saturday night by 4 men for improper advances towards a lady. The men were relatives of the lady and at home on the furlough at the time the deed was committed. The matter-of-fact tone of the report suggests how unremarkable it was for a black man to be taken from police custody and lynched in a public square. There has been no excitement among the people on the subject. In 1870, the Chicago Tribune reported that 3 other black residents of Forsyth were summarily hung one morning by the roadside in front of their own dwelling. Oldman Hutchins, suspended to the limb of a tree by an old ox chain, and his 2 sons by green withes cut from bushes. 16 years later, in 1886, a Forsyth man named Pete Holmes was accused of raping a 10-year-old white girl and was locked up in the Cumming jail. The Atlanta Constitution called Holmes a jet-black, greasy Negro, just 15 years of age, and reported that when intelligence of the crime began to spread to the friend and the girl's family became terribly stirred up, and before night a strong mob had been organized by lynch homes. Even when the next day he was sentenced 15 years in the penitentiary, people did not think the sentence sufficient. And Holmes was only saved from a lynch mob when the county sheriff speared him out of the back of the jail and rushed him to safety in Fulton Tower. Such scenes were common enough in the post-emancipation Forsyth that in 1897, Judge George Gober made a special trip from Atlanta to Cumming in order to try a man named Charlie Ward, who stood accused of raping a prominent farmer's 15-year-old daughter. Gober gave him the limit allowed by law, 20 years, and the Macon Telegraph, and a speedy trial was to prevent a case of lynching which had been planned to take place Christmas Day. These earlier lynchings and near lynchings suggest that rather than yielding to a sudden irresistible passion as lynchings were usually portrayed, the men pounding on the door of the Cumming jail on Tuesday 10th, 1912 were taking part in a time-honored ritual. Many would have heard the tales of past lynchings from their fathers and grandfathers. When Rob Edwards was arrested on suspicion of rape, they saw their chance to finally join in the great tradition, to show that they too were men of honor and no less committed to the defense of white womanhood. If Reid's solution to the problem of the lynch mob was to pretend it did not exist, his strategy worked, at least in the short term. According to one witness, Loomis stood his ground bravely against the assault and was warned to get back and save himself. Hearing the shouts and curses of hundreds of men who now viewed him as nothing but an obstacle to be overcome or passed through, Loomis reportedly locked the doors of the jail and put the heavy bars in place. He positioned himself between his prisoner and the mob, and through the barred door he pleaded with the mob leaders to settle down and go back home, and let the Blue Ridge Circuit Court take care of Big Rob Edwards. But outside was a murmur passing through the crowd, and soon a man who'd sent been sent to a nearby blacksmith shop, was ushered into the front, a long crowbar clenched in one hand and a sledgehammer in the other. As the front door creaked and splintered under the first blow of the sledge, Loomis drew his pistol and spread his arms and backed towards the rows of the cells. At the second blow, daylight streamed through the gash in the wood planks, and like that, the Jordan said, the mob came on. Farmers known to all the countryside were in front of the band, which advanced in broad daylight without masks, with the slightest fear of what the future might bring. The barred doors gave way under a few heavy blows, and the leaders rushed in, followed as many men could crowd into the corridors. Having risked his life to protect Edwards, Loomis was shoved aside as dozens of men stomped over the wreckage of the door and headed straight for the robe cells near the rear of the building. Inside one of them stood big Rob Edwards, with his back against the red brick wall. When the leaders of the mob emerged from the jail with a black man, they were cheered by thousands of whites who had rushed into town in hopes of witnessing exactly such a spectacle. Out into the sunshine came the Negro, said the Georgian, gray in his terror, his eyes rolling in abject fear. Edwards muttered prayers and supplications to the mob, one reporter noted. But these were soon drowned in the rain of blows which fell upon him. A rope was brought from a nearby store and a noose draped around the Negro's neck. The mob was fighting for a chance to get his victim, and only a certainty of wounding or killing a friend kept the pistols silent. Across the street up to the public square hurried the mob, its victim at the fore, and the Negro had lost his feet by this time and was being dragged by the rope, his body bumping over the stones. At the corner of the square, a telephone post and its cross-armed offered a convenient gallows. The end of the rope was tossed over the arm, and a dozen grasped it, and the Negro, perhaps already dead, was drawn high into the air. After a week of frustration, the abduction and killing only took minutes. There's no way to know whether Edwards died from a gunshot wound, a crowbar to the skull, or strangulation as he was dragged around the coming square. When his limp, blood-slick body finally rose into a view over the crowd, thousands of people joined in. As they loaded their weapons and took aim, rebel yells and howls of celebration rose from the crowd. Pistols and rifles cracked, a witness said, and the corpse was mangled into something hardly resembling a human form. The Marietta Journal claimed that as soon as the guns of those composing the mob were empty, quietly dispersed and returned to their work, but other accounts suggest that many in the crowd looked up at Edward's corpse and felt not satisfied but more hungry than ever. They had finally killed one of the accused rapists, and now their thoughts turned to the 5 young men arrested in connection with the Grace assault. The prisoners were only 40 miles south of Marietta, and even as people stood gawking at Edward's body, leaders of the mob waved to men in cars bound for the Marietta jail, where they'd hoped to do to Grant Smith and Tony Howell exactly what they've just done to Rob Edwards. Sheriff Reed emerged only once the excitement was over, when he claimed to have no idea that Rob Edwards wasn't still asleep in his cell. Having left Loomis in command, Reed could now shake his head and tell reporters he didn't know who broken down the jailhouse door, and who'd fired the first shot, and how exactly this young deputy failed to protect the prisoner. After learning that some of the lynchers were speeding out of town, Reed made a phone to Judge Newton Morris in Marietta, warning him that the mountaineers were threatening to come by and storm the jail there. In response, Morris ordered Cobb County Sheriff J.H. Kinnasid to move to the Grice prisoners again, this time to one jail in the area that could stop any mob, Atlanta's Fulton Tower, where the night before Ernest Knox had been set for safekeeping. In the end, the cars from Forsyth turned around just outside Marietta when a local farmer told them that the Grace prisoners had already been transferred to the tower. Pulling back into the coming square after dark, they rolled slowly past the splintered door frame that had just a few hours before been ripped to pieces with sledges and crowbars. On a corner near the courthouse, they passed the mutilated, unrecognizable corpse of Rob Edwards, still hanging from the yardarm of a telephone pole, reporter for the Georgian took a glance at the scene before heading back south to Atlanta. Edward's body swings to this hour, he wrote, riddled with bullets dangling in the wind as warning to frightened Negroes who are hurrying from town. As the last of the crowd drifted home, Reid ordered Lummis to cut Edwards down and drag him to the lawn of the Forsyth County Courthouse. There, the North Georgian said, his body lay out all night without guard, and it was not touched. The next morning, County Coroner W.R. Barnett knelt over the stiff corpse, examining the lacerations on Edward's swollen neck, the hundreds of holes of bullets and buckshot, and the deep impact wounds in his skull. Barnett's report concluded that the 24-year-old black man had suffered multiple gunshot and blunt trauma to the head, despite eyewitness accounts saying that farmers known to all the countryside had come unmasked and thrown off a tent. Barnett wrote that Rob Edwards died at the hands of parties unknown. In the days following, Georgia newspapers were quick to declare the bloody ritual been an end, not a beginning, to Forsyth's race trouble. The provocation of the people of Forsyth was great, said the Cherokee advance, and they simply did what Anglo-Saxons have done, north, south, east, and west, where Negroes have outraged white women, and they formed a mob and took the law into their own hands. The Atlanta Journal agreed that the gruesome as the killing was, whites had now exhausted their rage, no further trouble was expected. An editorial in the Gainesville Times went further, congratulating the white mobs of Forsyth for having done no worse and for having lynched no more. 2 assault criminals in 1 week, and people were up the high pitch, the editor said, and they controlled themselves with remarkable self-restraint. Okay.